Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of the hour. India and the European Union finalise a free trade agreement after 2 decades of talks. EU chief Ursula von der Leyen says the deal creates a 2 billion person market. In a visit to Beijing, Finland's Prime Minister says China can help Russia's war end by pressuring President Putin. President Xi calls for upholding a UN-centered global order. Attacks across Ukraine kill 4 people and wound nearly 24, officials have said. President Zelensky says the strikes undermine peace efforts and calls for more pressure on Moscow. Top federal immigration leaders begin leaving Minneapolis after a second U.S. citizen is fatally shot by officers. The White House turns to border czar Tom Homan to take control as tensions remain high. North Korea launches 2 ballistic missiles towards the Sea of Japan. The projectiles splashed down outside Japan's ease in Pyongyang's second test this month. China says it is ready to deepen cooperation with Britain as Prime Minister Keir Starmer visits this week. Starmer is set to meet President Xi Jinping and other senior Chinese leaders. France backs a ban on social media for under 15s under a new bill. The EU says it will be responsible for enforcing age verification on platforms. One battle after another and Sinners top this year's BAFTA shortlist. Both films also dominate Oscar nominations ahead of the March ceremony. We start this hour with some breaking news coming out of the United States, and Minnesota's chief federal judge has ordered the head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement to appear in court, threatening contempt sanctions over what he calls repeated defiance of judicial orders. The U.S. District Judge Patrick Schiltz says his patience is at an end, accusing ICE of slow walking or outright ignoring release orders tied to Operation Metro Surge, a major immigration crackdown in the Twin Cities. The judge says immigrants ordered released have remained detained, been transferred out of the state or left stranded far from their families, despite court rulings in their favour. Schiltz's order targets ICE Acting Director Todd Lyons, who must personally explain why the agency failed to comply with a January release order. Joining us now to discuss the developing situation in Minneapolis is Raymond Vickery. He's an international affairs expert, American attorney and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. Raymond, as always, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a great pleasure in having these conversations with you. Of course, this situation in Minneapolis is developing. We're seeing ICE agents leave the city. However, operations have been going on there for about 2 weeks now. We've now seen a judge order the ICE chief for the operation to court. Checks and balances in terms of this situation, and over the past 2 weeks, how do we assess them about how they've acted in not just this situation, but of course the broader events which have occurred in Minnesota during the deployment of ICE troops?
Well, thanks very much for having me and allowing me to comment. You know, democracy requires more than just elections. It requires a rule of law. It requires respect for human rights. And under the U.S. Constitution, as you point out, there's a system of checks and balances in which the judicial arm of the government, the courts, and the legislative are to act as a check on the executive branch. Unfortunately, President Donald Trump has not seen to conduct himself or his administration in accordance with constitutional requirements and norms. Instead, he has opted for what they call a unitary presidency, meaning one which is unchecked. You will recall that in the New York Times article in regard to foreign affairs, he said there is no check on me except my own morality, which is questionable at best. So this is a situation which has deteriorated because President Trump has chosen Minnesota, and particularly because of the Somalia immigrants there, who some of whom were involved in a scheme to defraud. He wants to paint the entire community in Minnesota with that and a show of strength. But of course, it's not working at this point in regard to the district courts, and they are standing up with release orders and for due process. So it's a very, very difficult situation. I note that the administration president seems to have backed off somewhat, at least in terms of its rhetoric. But make no mistake about it, this is a part of the President Donald Trump's push to show that he does not have to operate with congressional or judicial restraints, and he can do as he pleases. I believe that U.S. institutions will hold, but it's going to be a very, very difficult time.
Raymond, Minnesota has been a Democratic state since 1976. It's voted for the Democratic presidential candidate every single time since then. But of course, over the past 24 hours, we've seen developments come out of this, and we've seen a change in stance from Donald Trump. We saw a Truth Social post where he said that he just talked to Governor Walz, the governor of Minnesota, and he said that their visions were aligned on immigration and his pledge to work with them. We've also, of course, seen him withdraw his ICE chief there, Bavino, and send Border Czar Tom Homan to Minneapolis to assess the situation, whatever that means. Of course, how do you see this situation play out? Have the protesters got Donald Trump to concede here? Of course, by losing two American citizens in the process, of course.
Well, I think the polls are showing politically what he's doing with ICE and turning it into really a federal police force for general purposes is not going over well. The killings which have taken place by ICE, the so-called administrative warrants, where you don't even have a judge who's signing off on breaking and entering, which is flatly contrary to the United States Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which prevents unreasonable searches and seizures. And finally, I think that President Trump is seeing that this is really eating into the swing voters. The MAGA voters will never change. As President Trump has said, he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and they wouldn't change. But there are reasonable people who are looking at this situation and saying, this is not America. This is not what we have fought for over 250 years, and it's hurting. So he is having to back off. Now, whether it means anything really in terms of how he acts and how ICE acts is very doubtful. Donald Trump is an expert at trying to create a false reality. And if there is some chink in that, as there was at the time of COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, then he backs off and says, well, I never said that, that's not what I meant, and so forth.
Yes.
It's a very, very difficult situation.
Raymond, do stay with us as we move over to another ICE-related development and U.S. Immigration Agency ICE has confirmed it will send agents to Italy to support American security operations during the Winter Olympics in Milan Cortina, which will begin on February the 6th. The move has sparked controversy and political backlash in Italy following 2 fatal shootings involving ICE officers in Minneapolis. ICE said its Homeland Security Investigations Unit will assist U.S. diplomatic security and Italian authorities in vetting risks from transnational crime, stressing that all security operations remain under Italian control. The agency insisted it will not conduct immigration enforcement outside the United States. However, Italian officials appeared initially unaware of ICE's involvement. Milan's mayor, Beppe Sala, strongly opposed the presence of ICE agents, questioning whether they align with Italy's democratic standards of security. But the president of the Milan Cortina Organizing Committee stated that ICE will only be there for technical reasons. Let's take a listen in.
Ho sentito che appunto che ci sarà questa presenza esclusivamente per fatti tecnici, che abbiamo alte personalità del governo americano, però che non hanno nulla a che fare con quello che sono gli aspetti della sicurezza delle Olimpiadi. Questo, da quello che altrettanto so, avviene normalmente o quasi normalmente quando ci sono presidenti o vicepresidenti o in questo caso il segretario di Stato americano. Tutto qui. Peraltro ci sono anche altri paesi che hanno una loro attività di sicurezza a supporto specifico del capo di Stato, quindi non è un discorso che riguarda le Olimpiadi, ma la singola persona. Sono fatti tecnici, non mi risulta che ci sia, quindi secondo me è sbagliato sostenere una tesi diversa nel modo più assoluto.
Raymond joins us once again. Raymond, a lot of people around the world will be looking at this, asking why. Is this normal practice for ICE agents to be deployed abroad, considering the current controversy surrounding them?
Well, it certainly is not normal practice. There is a normal practice for law enforcement agencies to cooperate in providing security in a major event abroad, but it's done usually in cooperation with the host country. And the whole world is watching what's going on in Minnesota. One of the strengths of America has been its soft power, its willingness to lead on issues of democracy, rule of law, institutional checks and balances. And the world sees that that's not what's happening with ICE. It's being turned into a federal police force to operate on its own terms. And obviously the mayor of Milan and other Italians, they want no part of it. There are strong people-to-people ties between Italy and the United States. The immigrant population from Italy was one of the things that built the United States in the late 19th century and into the 20th, and is still extremely important. So there is a sensitivity to an agency like ICE who attacks immigrants, primarily those now from other countries other than Italy. But Italy has an institutional memory about this. So the rest of the world is watching. This is not good for the United States. We cannot operate in a my way or the highway approach with a federal police force that does as it wants to do. And we have every hope that given midterms, given court decisions, that there will be a reining in. But as the Italian situation shows, the damage is already being done internationally, and we can only hope that other great democracies, whether they be in Europe, whether they be India, Japan, will work together to try to restore some semblance of a rules-based order in the world and in individual nations.
Indeed. Raymond, do stay with us as we move over to Europe for our next story. And Slovakia has announced plans to file a lawsuit against the European Union's decision to ban Russian gas imports by 2027. Prime Minister Robert Fico confirmed the move, stating that Slovakia will challenge the EU's decision on the grounds of subsidiary and proportionality. This follows the EU's approval of the ban, which Slovakia and Hungary opposed, as both countries remain heavily reliant on Russian energy. The ban, set to phase out Russian gas by 2027, aims to reduce EU funding for Russia's war in Ukraine. However, Fico has criticised the measure, calling it energy suicide and warning that it could cost Slovakia up to €500 million annually. He expressed hope that by the time the ban takes effect, the war will be over. Let's take a listen in.
My sme presvedčení, dámy a páni, že ide o štandardnú sankciu. A v prípade sankcií sa vyžaduje jednomyseľnosť. Lenže komisia vedela, že ak by bola jednomyseľnosť, tak takáto hlúposť nemôže prejsť, alebo by boli viaceré krajiny, ktoré buď by boli proti, alebo sa zdržali minimálne hlasovania. Preto obišli tento princíp a toto nariadenie bolo schválené kvalifikovanou väčšinou, čo považujeme za porušenie základných princípov, základných zmluv, na ktorých stojí Európska únia. Keď skončí vojnový konflikt, všetci si polámu nohy, ako budú utekať do Ruskej federácie a robiť biznis ako obyčajne, čiže biznis.
Raymond joins us once again. Of course, $500 million annually, a substantial amount of money for a country like Slovakia. Do you think the challenge, it could encourage other energy-dependent states to break ranks, weakening the EU's united front on Russia here?
Well, thanks for allowing me to comment on this. It seems to me that this shows that in order to wage peace, just like you do wage war, you have to have a strategy, you have to have partners, and you have to have principles, and you need leadership. In the past, the United States of America has provided that leadership, so-called leaders of the free world. That has been thrown under the bus, if you will, by the Trump administration, which is saying every country for itself. The difficulty, of course, now faced by EU in replacing that leadership, in coming up with a strategy which will actually end the war that has been waged by Russia against Ukraine, becomes apparent when you look at what's happening in Slovakia. You look at Hungary, you look at Bulgaria, all of whom have their own interests and really a somewhat different orientation from the rest of the EU. So EU is getting its act together, trying to wean itself off of the oil and gas from Russia. But it requires leadership and it requires strategy, and the EU has relied upon the United States for that leadership and strategy and principles, and that is no longer there. And so you're in a transition period, and you get countries like Slovakia and Hungary, which are heavily dependent upon Russian gas, and say, well, look, if it's America first, and why couldn't it be Slovakia first, and Hungary first, and Bulgaria first? Rather than looking at a longer-term approach that peace has to be waged and it's indivisible. You can't have somebody like Putin invading an independent country, the worst violation of the UN Charter in 80 years, and just say, well, it's every person for himself. But we're not to a point where American leadership has been replaced in regard to waging peace.
Raymond Vickery, as always, it is a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us here on NewsX World. We now move on to a further update, and the Russian Defence Minister Andrei Belousov says that recent events in Venezuela and Iran require their defence ministries to constantly analyse global security developments and take appropriate action. He added that amid rapid changes in the international military and political environment, regular exchanges in military cooperation are essential. These comments came during a call with Chinese Defence Minister Dong Jun as the two sides discussed strengthening strategic coordination and improving military communication in mechanisms. The talks reflect continued close defence relations between Russia and China as both countries respond to global security challenges. Let's listen into what the Russian Defence Minister had to say.
С момента нашей последней встречи с вами в июне прошлого года в Циндао произошло много событий, которые существенно повлияли на международную обстановку. Примеры Венесуэлы, Ирана требуют от наших ведомств организации постоянного анализа ситуации в сфере безопасности и соответствующих действий. Сегодня в условиях динамичного изменения мировой военно-политической обстановки востребован регулярный обмен мнениями по военному сотрудничеству.
Mohammed Osman joins us now, a Middle East expert joining us live from Cairo. Mohammed, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. They have said, the Russian Defence Minister and the Chinese official have said that their defence ministries are constantly analysing global security developments and taking appropriate action. Rapid changes in the international military and political environment, regular changes in military cooperation are essential. Are they talking about Donald Trump's unpredictability in the geopolitical landscape?
Thank you for having me, Thomas. Always a pleasure to be with you. And of course, undoubtedly, yes, President Trump and the United States are the elephants in the room when it comes to Russia and China's concern. And I think that now that they are going public, basically with their statements, the Russians at least, about their very overt concerns about the US's unilateral actions against countries that are considered to be within the Russian and Chinese sphere of influence, or countries that are allies or at least have close partnerships with both Beijing and Russia and Moscow. And it seems that the United States move, for example, against Venezuela. The United States makes no secret that one of the main drivers or motives behind its aggression against Venezuela and the changes that it has imposed on this country, including the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, part of it, one of the driving forces behind this, is the elimination of Chinese and Russian influence in the Western hemisphere. So the United States is not being really discreet about its intentions and motives when it comes to targeting these countries. The same goes for Iran, for example. Iran is a very strong partner of both Russia and China in the Middle East. China gets about 15% of its oil from Iran. That's a huge number, given China is the world's second largest economy and the biggest, one of the largest and most powerful economies in the world, an $18 trillion economy. So basically getting 15% of their oil from one single country like Iran is something that is of strategic significance. And it did get about 4% or 5% of its oil needs also from Venezuela. So now they've lost Venezuela as one of their net exporters of oil. Are they about to lose Iran as well? Especially that now the United States is pondering with the idea, not even if they don't launch a full-scale military operation against Iran, they might impose a naval blockade, which will basically sever all of the oil supplies that come from Iran to China. The same goes for Russia with regards to Iran. Iran supported Russia in Ukraine. Iran and Russia have cooperated in Syria until the Assad regime fell with US support, which was also another blow to Russian influence in the Middle East. And also at the same time, the fall of the Iranian regime, if it happens, it will be a huge blow to Russian influence in both in West Asia, the Middle East, and the Central Asia even as well. Because so basically the Chinese and the Russians are signaling that they are not content, they are not okay with the approach the Americans are taking, and that at some point, given these provocations, they might have to respond one way or the other. However, the extent of this response or how they will deal with this, of course, remains a mystery to me, Thomas, because it doesn't seem that China and Russia are eager to enter into any sort of confrontation with the United States over a third party.
Mohammed, do stay with us as we move on and over, but we move to West Asia, and a spokesman for the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, says recent clashes in Syria between Kurdish forces and the Syrian military risk undermining the fragile peace process with Turkey. PKK political wing spokesman Zagros Hiwa described the fighting as both a setback and a deliberate plot to derail talks. Hiwa says developments in Syria and the wider Middle East directly affect negotiations aimed at ending decades of conflict between Ankara and the PKK. He warned that attacks targeting Kurdish forces were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader conspiracy to disrupt progress towards peace. The comments come amid heightened tensions across northern Syria, where Kurdish groups remain deeply entangled in regional power struggles. Analysts say renewed violence could complicate Turkey's efforts to revive dialogue and stabilise its borders. Mohammed, is the PKK's claim of a deliberate talk to derail talks credible here? Is this framing aimed at shifting blame away from internal fractures within the Kurdish movement?
When we look at the PKK in Turkey, of course, we cannot separate it from the YPG and the Rojava elements or entities in Syria, because the Syrian Kurdish movement is very, very well connected ideologically and even on a structural level to the PKK, and they both share and are inspired by the same ideas largely. Unlike, for example, the Kurdish parties in Iraq, which have long diverged from the track, the Marxist, the revolutionary track of the, for example, the PKK in Turkey. So this is a completely different faction. However, in Syria, the SDF, which basically is constituted largely of and led by Kurdish YPJ militias, are very, very well connected to the PKK. So as of late, of course, we know, Thomas, that the PKK has been waging an insurgency against Turkey since the 1970s. However, a historic agreement was reached very recently, by which the PKK and its leader, who is imprisoned in Turkey, Abdullah Öcalan, has decided to renounce violence and disarm, basically, and renounce the idea of secession from Turkey. And those fighters who turned over their weapons and renounced violence, many of them moved to the northeastern Syria to join the SDF and the YPJ over there, because there is a de facto autonomous Kurdish region in which they can function and live beyond Turkish control and domination. However, now with the latest developments in Syria and the offensive carried out by the Syrian government forces against the SDF, taking large swaths of land and reducing their areas of control basically to Al-Hasaka and Qamishli and the surrounding areas, it seems now this project of Kurdish autonomy in Syria is being dismantled, essentially, of course, with Turkish pressure and with Turkish support, and even with the Turkish threat that if this is not seen through until the end, Turkey will intervene militarily to see it through if the Syrian government isn't able to end the SDF's control and effectively force the SDF to integrate into the Syrian state per the March 2025 agreement. This leaves the PKK at a very precarious position, at a very vulnerable position. They will have no leeway anymore to function as a proper political entity. However, I do not see that reversing the peace process in Turkey, because the PKK has been substantially weakened, and Kurdish interests now in Turkey are represented by legitimate parties like the HDP through Turkish institutions, constitutional institutions. So there is no need for armed struggle any further, Thomas.
Yes, Mohammed Osman, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much. Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more.